Hello, everyone. I'm Deb Habib from Seeds of Solidarity Farm and Education Center in Orange, and I'm truly thrilled to introduce the keynote speaker, Greg Watson, because he's absolutely one of my favorite people in the world, truly. Greg was a pivotal mentor for me in the early 1980s at the New Alchemy Institute on Cape Cod, where he served as education director and then later became executive director. And he definitely remains a valued mentor and friend over 30 years later. Greg's experience and reach is so vast. He's currently Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. Greg served, as Senator Comerford mentioned, Greg served as Massachusetts Commissioner of Agriculture, not once, but twice. And he launched critical statewide urban agriculture initiatives, among many other amazing things. In regards to urban agriculture, and I'd forgotten about this, in the late 1970s, Greg organized an early network of Boston area farmers markets, and later brought his amazing community organizing skills to his work at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, where he served as executive director. Greg's great energy also took form as the first executive director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust. So there's so much more to say than time allows, but I would definitely be remiss to not add that Greg's work and dedication to achieving a just and sustainable world is inspired by the systems thinking of Buckminster Fuller. And I personally know these are some of his favorite conversations to have. On top of it all, and this wasn't in the bio, but Greg's a great artist and cartoonist. And very importantly, Greg is just such an amazing community builder on all levels and a true visionary. And that is what this world surely needs now. So Greg, I'm just thrilled to introduce you. It's such a great pleasure to know you, and onward.
Deb, thank you so much. I'm grateful that you just remember the good things, because I'm sure we went through quite a bit during our days at New Alchemy. I'm going to, before I get into, and I do have a presentation because I don't want you looking at my face for the next half hour, 45 minutes, but by way of full disclosure, I will say that I pivoted a little bit given the developments, not only of since COVID and obviously the ongoing issues around climate change, but obviously this past week as well. My talk will emphasize more people and process and systems. I'm not going to try to pretend that I can tell you technically what you can do with regard to farming and organic farming, although I'll do a little bit of that. But I just want to make sure that you kind of understand sort of the systems and people part of it. So with that, no more caveats. I'm going to see if I can't work this thing here and get to. So anyway, I had a little bit of a consternation too about what I was going to call this. I originally talked about redesigning our local food and economic system. That was a little presumptuous, I thought, but I do think, well, I don't think, I know it's possible to reshape systems. And I think there was an earlier comment about whether or not we can make the kind of systemic change that's we're talking about or that's absolutely necessary. And I will rely upon past history to hopefully make the point that we can absolutely do it. I will begin with a couple of sort of headlines from recent papers. And one is the world is broken. I think the world is not broken. I think the systems that we always knew were vulnerable, fragile, and unresponsive have certainly buckled under the recent pressures, not just COVID, but again, I want to make sure that the issues of climate change, but also social inequality and racism are also part of that system that we have to address as we talk about moving forward and anticipating and preparing for a resilient food system in an age of incredible uncertainty. I think that's just no question. And this opinion piece from earlier this year, again, sort of in response to COVID, was talking about I think the frustration and the angst that we're all feeling, that no one knows what's going to happen. And that is absolutely true. But then, as Deb pointed out, my guru, Buckminster Fuller, in fully acknowledging that, says that the best way to predict the future is to design it. So I think that's sort of what I will sort of how I approach my talk. And I will also take the chance to quote Margaret Mead. And this is a quote I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but I think it's really relevant for these times. That never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. So what do I want to do? I want to talk about some lessons from history and talk about what I think are some incredibly monumental systemic changes that have taken place in our food system. For some of you, I know this is going to be sort of, you already know this. I think for maybe some of the younger members of NOFA, this may not be as well known, but it's important to know a little bit about where we came from. And beginning at the end of the Second World War, right up to the mid-70s, I came to Massachusetts in 1967 to attend Tufts University. I was actually already sort of an environmentalist by the fact that I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, the banks of Lake Erie and the Cuyahoga River. For those of you who don't know, the Lake Erie was deemed biologically dead because of so much pollution, and the Cuyahoga River was so polluted with flammable pollutants that its surface would on occasion erupt into flames, and the river would literally be on fire. So I, even as a city resident, I became an environmentalist, but was taken to task by my colleagues at the Tufts chapter of the Afro-American Society, who could not understand how an African-American in 1967, in the midst of the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, could commit to the environment. And for that, the environment also encompassed agriculture. I'll get into that in a little bit. And the reason was, as when I queried and said, well, why not? And they asked me, well, with the slogans of no growth, limited growth, you probably have heard this as well, though, where is there room for economic equality? And for most of my colleagues, it was a sinister ploy to maintain the status quo. And I can honestly say that at that time, I did not have an intellectual response to their challenge. I had an intuitive sense that inequality and environmental quality were compatible, that we could in fact improve the environment, we can improve, but I did not have a real response. So I kind of went on a quest and went on a journey. So anyway, but that, having said that, I want to come back here to agriculture and what I walked into in terms of the trends. The trends were downward in terms of farmland and farmers and farmland acreage. Again, beginning at the end of Second World War and right up until the 1970s. I will say at that time, there were a lot of discussion about Massachusetts just relinquishing its ability to grow food. Oil was cheap. There was this sentiment that we were a high-tech industry. Our growing season was short. Didn't make a lot of sense to invest a lot of time and a lot of energy into our agricultural economy. And we really do have a couple of people, and one of them was Commissioner Fred Winthrop, and Governor, actually Frank Sargent, and then Mike Dukakis, who basically couldn't accept that. And Fred Winthrop commissioned Ray Goldberg of the Harvard Business School to create a blue ribbon commission. And he said, I need to know what my options are. What can we do? What are all the options available to? And this was important. What is it that the state can do to stop this hemorrhaging of our agricultural economy? Let's pretend the feds aren't there. Let's even pretend that the private sector isn't there. What is it within our capacity to do to make things, to make this whole again? And this policy, only 22 pages, this food and agricultural policy laid out a scenario and laid out some doable things that the Massachusetts citizens and the legislature could do. All I'll say now is a couple of them were, out of this grew the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, because there was a sense the first thing you have to do is preserve the resource, the land. And then there were a few others that I became involved with, and I'm going to get to that, was how do we protect and preserve not just farmland, but farm businesses and farmers. And so there was a great deal of emphasis placed on direct marketing, and that covered the whole gamut. It was roadside stands, it was um, uh, um, uh, pick your own. And at that time, now this is 1978, there really were no or urban farmers markets in Boston, no big city urban farmers markets. And interestingly enough, and I'm bringing this up because I want to show you the how there was a really integrated and diverse group of people who embraced this need to save our agricultural economy at this time. And the leader in terms of the legislature was Mel King. Mel was from the South End. He was a passionate supporter of agriculture, to the point at one meeting, and I was actually there in the State House, he was actually asked by one of his colleagues, Mel, why are you so god awful interested in agriculture? Obviously, I'm indicating he's Black, he's from the city of Boston, and Mel just looked at him and said, because I eat. And as this points out, he really was the leading advocate. Massachusetts, back then, in those days, I don't think we had very many farmers, we still don't today, in the legislature. And so it really was up to us to do it, most of the folks in the city. Part of that support, interesting enough, came from a group, and it was called the Boston Urban Gardeners. And I call it the pre-internet virtual organization, and it was a network of organizers. And right there, dead center, is Charlotte Kahn. And it was a network of folks who were committed to providing resources for people who lived in the city to grow food. Didn't have their own home community gardening, but in a secure and lasting way. And I should point out that they were what's the best way to say this? The members of this network cut across all disciplines. They weren't just urban gardeners. They had the savvy to say, we need folks from the Action for Boston's Community Development. We need Boston City Councilors to be a part of this, because we're going to have to come up with a diverse strategy for doing what we need to do to preserve and to do this. And it's sort of interesting. I was on a recent panel with someone from the UK who talked about the UK's allotment program, where folks who want to, in the city, who want to garden can access a program in the UK government program, gets them on a list for them to be able to access public land to garden. And that's in stark contrast to a lot of what happens in the US, where for the most part, gardening, urban gardening, is part of the struggle. It really is part of the struggle. And it's not the state that comes to that provides the resources to get it done. It really is the community organizers. But as you can see, the whole notion of growing our own food, not so much self-reliance, but increased self-reliance on food, was a big thing back in the 1970s. And I realize this is ancient history for a lot of you, before probably many of you were born. But here's Mel King again talking about the city's common ground. This was the opening first day of the Boston Farmers Markets, July 8th, 1978. And I remember it regularly because it sort of made me aware of issues around farmers markets and why I was advised that these markets will never happen. As a matter of fact, Lieutenant Governor Tommy O'Neill said, you won't be able to do this. And I didn't understand what he meant until I was hired, went out, talked to a number of farmers, got 20 commitments from farmers to come into Dorchester on that Saturday morning. Dorchester Avenue, cut it off, farmers committed, I'll be there. 3 TV stations, Boston Herald American, Boston Globe, Commissioner of Agriculture, Lieutenant Governor, market open at 9 o'clock, not a single farmer. Nobody, not a farmer. The crowds were there. They were ready. The news, and obviously I'm getting these looks, where's everyone? 9:15, not a single farmer. And then finally at around 9:30, Ketchy Barbarian from Northborough drives up with his pickup truck with his wife and his daughter, and they are mobbed. Couple things happen. Just want to, again, in terms of our relationships with the press and the media, rather than having a wide angle shot the next day on TV where you had a street and only one farmer, every shot was a close up. Every shot was a close up, and the farmers couldn't get there. They couldn't unload the truck fast enough. People were buying like crazy, and their buddies saw that evening. And the next week, we had 20 farmers showing up at the Dorchester market. But here's the thing: what I didn't realize, and what was told to me afterwards by farmers, they were afraid. They were afraid to come into the city. And then they actually began to ask me, if we come to the market in Boston, will you be there for the full 4 hours? As if I could do anything if there was like going to be any kind of trouble. I know what kind of trouble they were expecting, but well, the trouble they kind of thought was that they would not be able to get out of the city after making money at the farmers markets. They were just honest about that. On the flip side of that, I got some criticism from the hosting communities who wanted to know, why were they being asked to go out of their way to accommodate these rich farmers and by setting up the market. So clearly what we had was a gross sort of misrepresentation, stereotyping of these two folks. And if nothing else happened with the farmers markets over the years, I really mean this, that would have been a major accomplishment. And these are the sort of things that happened afterwards, after the farmers did come in and we were able to sort of get the markets up and going, and they did expand pretty rapidly. We began to realize that what we were developing back in those days, I'm not sure it still exists now, but what we developed then was more of a collaborative and more of a partnership than just a place where commercial transactions happen. I hope that still exists. I'm not sure. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I mean, it was clear we set up a network of markets and Dorchester, Roxbury, low-income communities in Boston, but we also had markets in Newton and Brookline. Farmers, after overcoming their fears, it was very interesting how they sort of surmised they knew where the poor communities were, obviously. I shouldn't say obviously, but they did. And they could tell that Brookline and Newton were affluent. And I probably shouldn't tell you, there's certain things we did we probably could never get away with these days, but on their own, they decided we're going to charge a little less in Dorchester and Roxbury, and we're going to charge a little more in Brookline and Newton. And that's what they did. And the communities understood that and they agreed. I mean, there were just things that were happening sort of organically that you sort of said, this is actually a unique situation. And it's a dynamic that speaks a lot about trying to build relationships. The technical pieces that you guys are going to be talking about probably for the rest of the weekend are really critically important. But what you've got to do in terms of making these types of changes last, from my perspective, is you've got to understand what these relationships are. I'm only bringing this up. This is a Suffolk County Cooperative Extension Service. The Boston Urban Gardens, or Urban Gardens, actually had an extension service that was able to focus on issues relevant to urban gardening. And in those days, it was mostly, well, a lot of it had centered around lead. We had 5,000 parts per million lead in our garden in Cambridge before we were told to turn it over. There was a creativity, an innovative nature, social entrepreneur sort of attitude about this group, the Boston Urban Gardeners. When they needed something, if they didn't have money, they tried to figure out how they could marshal resources. It's from their broad network and members of the, in this case, it was a 642nd Battalion of the U.S. Army that they were able to, with the help of Lieutenant Governor John Kerry, to convince them to haul topsoil from the University of Massachusetts Medical School to the gardens in Boston. Today, we probably couldn't do that. There would be headlines about misuse of resources and the time of the reserves. And I think that as organizers, you basically understand what the cultural and social context is in terms of the strategy that you come up with. And I think they would also agree we couldn't do that today. The challenge is what resources and what strategies are available. So I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a segue here, because I'm part of this approach to sort of dealing with the designing and anticipating how to reshape our food system. Well, I'm talking food systems, and our economic systems really does require that we do, in fact, think globally and act locally. I don't know if folks have seen this. This was an article in recently in ProPublica, simultaneously at ProPublica and the New York Times magazine. And it's about Russia preparing for climate change. And their preparation for climate change, they're anticipating good things for agriculture. They see a warming. They see the western part of their country actually thawing, and that they are going to be world leaders in agriculture. And as part of their strategy, and they're recognizing things got to happen. You have to start planning sooner than later. They are actually encouraging folks from other countries to come in, and they're making available land for them to farm. So you've got folks from China, you've got folks from Southeast Asia, because Russia has a lot of land and they don't have a lot of people. I'm bringing this up just as sort of the context, but climate change does require, well, two things. It's going to affect different places differently, obviously, and we've got to be thinking about what that's going to mean for us here in Massachusetts, the United States of Massachusetts. But it also means you're taking some risk, because you're going to have to start to do that planning sooner rather than later. Now, we're not going to be start talking about, obviously, about thawing and mass migrations, but once again, just making the connection between sort of big thinking, thinking globally, and acting locally. We've got a new administration in Washington. With any luck, they will be supporting some version of the Green New Deal. And I think that that's going to include not only, as you probably know, not just renewable energy and wind turbines and solar energy, but it's also going to include agriculture. Bernie Sanders and others have done a great deal of including agriculture as part of the Green New Deal, and kind of figure out how those are going to sort of interact with one another. Oh, I wanted to point out that as part of that, one of the things that was talked about here is that we are going to need a new worldview in order to make this thing happen, to give us the context for the changes that are going to be necessary. And for folks, I'm sure here, NOFA, that's not really so much of an issue, but our goal is to work with, obviously, the larger, broader community that I think is not so much embrace or even understand what this new worldview is, and are more comfortable with the status quo than what they see as progressive or radical changes. So the question is, I think we do need a new worldview. I think that part of that has already been developed, as Deb Habib mentioned. I think there's no question that one of the greatest experiences, grounding for me, I grew up in the city, not a farmer. My own real hands-on practical experience in terms of understanding these systems was during my years at the New Alchemy Institute. Some of you may not know what that was. What is a 12-acre Think Do organization, the Think Do Tank, Falmouth, Massachusetts, founded by a couple of marine biologists, Dr. John Todd, Dr. Bill McClarney, Nancy Jack Todd, who is a writer, poet, and activist. And this organization was developed during the early stages of the environmental movement. They grew out of Earth Day. The emphasis was on trying to come up with viable alternatives to meeting our basic needs of food, energy, and shelter. They appreciated the demonstrations and the Earth Day sort of demonstrations that pointed out what was wrong with the current systems of both of food and energy production and even shelter, but felt that there was their calling was to put together a group of scientists and researchers and activists to actually come up with alternatives that were environmentally sound and hopefully economically viable. We were naive in that we felt that we needed to develop these strategies around nature's strategy for design. So in essence, and this was, much of this happened, I should point out, before I got there, but this was sort of the place where a lot of the organic agriculture, along with Rodale and others, really came into being. So it was organic agriculture, it was aquaculture, it was passive solar architecture, and it was integrated systems. I'm going to get into a little, and including aquaponics, and a little different than some of the aquaponics that are being done today. But it was a way for me to become grounded and to understand that we can actually rethink our technologies. There was nothing that prevented us from doing that, although we were challenged on that. But we could also rethink our economics. Because my sense is when people keep asking me, and maybe we've gotten beyond that, but I know that in urban ag and other areas, people ask me, so when is this going to become economically viable? What do we need to do to achieve the sort of economic viability for the strategy that we come up with? My response is almost always, they're already economically viable. They're in the wrong context. And I really do believe that. So when we talk about, again, folks, the guy up at the top there is E.F. Schumacher, German economist who wrote Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. The woman in the lower right is Jane Jacobs, who wrote, and Jane Jacobs was an incredible person, a person who didn't have the type of academic credentials that you would expect someone who became sort of an expert in and respected in urban planning and urban development, and stood up to people like Moses, who was a developer in New York City, was going to tear and pretty much obliterate neighborhoods so that he could develop high rises in New York City. And both her organizing and her knowledge of urban planning squelched that. And she just was an amazing person. Death and Life of Great American Cities, Cities and the Wealth of Nations. Her focus was on cities. Bob Swan, along with Susan Witt, was a co-founder of the Schumacher Center. It was originally the E.F. Schumacher Society, and it's now where I work, the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I do want to point out that a couple of the things that they talk about here that I think are important as we talk about our reshaping our economies. A couple of the strategies that I think are really, or at least the one that I think is worth making sure we focus on, is import substitution. What is it that we're importing that we're now that could in fact be produced locally? Scale is obviously a part of it, different types of technologies and patterns of ownership. And the thing that they're probably best known for, when I go back there, is local currency. And the whole idea, Jane Jacobs and others believe that currency is a tool that provides information about the health of local economies, and that federal dollars cannot do that. And she felt that if you're really interested in understanding and building communities, currency is the lifeblood. And the notion of developing your own currency obviously was one of those concepts that immediately got hit with, you can't do that. Same thing that happened with the farmers markets. You can't do that. It's illegal to print your own money. And in fact, it is not. And it has a great many benefits. By the way, the central banks of the United States are currently in the process of trying to figure out how to transition our monetary system over to cryptocurrency. They're basically said the goal is to eliminate sort of the paper money piece, which will be have some obviously great impacts, I think, on a lot of people, a lot of plans for community development, because you're going to take this concept of money, which for a lot of people is already somewhat abstract. I mean, I think there still are a lot of people who feel that when you deposit money in the bank, it basically sits there and somehow magically creates or develops interest, and then you kind of come back and take it when you're looking at it, not realizing where the investments go. But this notion of local currency that I'm going to come back to was one of the sort of the keys. So the other part of this is the circular economy. I'm using this graphic not as any kind of definitive graphic, but I just wanted to I wanted to conceptualize where we need to be thinking about, or where we're thinking about at the Schumacher Center, and others of us who are concerned about transforming, reshaping the economy are the way that we're thinking. And obviously it's, I won't go into all of it, but it really is talking about reforming, reducing our use, reusing, collection, recycling. And then sometimes there are things that we can't, in fact, um, um, deal with on site. And there are also some raw materials that we have to import from outside, whatever our boundaries are. And I think that's an issue that you're going to hear more and more about as we get into um, plans and strategies for battling climate change, and with particularly the renewable energy part of it. Deb mentioned that I was director of the state's Renewable Energy Trust Fund. They're the almost, I won't call it dirty, but the real troubling secret about renewables right now, especially I bring this up because of our getting ready to hopefully be able to entertain proposals and prospects of a Green New Deal. Two things sort of are striking. One is that renewable energy clearly will not eliminate extraction by any means. As a matter of fact, there will be a lot more mining, a lot more extraction if we want to meet the greenhouse gas emission goals that have been set, if every state does it on their own. The Netherlands recently tried to do it, and they were committed, and they came up with a plan, and they wanted to implement it, and they just said, there are not enough metals. We can't, there's no way we can do it. They were going to have to build 14,000 wind turbines in order to just for that one country to meet its greenhouse goals. So we've got to start thinking differently about that. And part of the solution, by the way, to that, or at least the approach that we're going to have to take, that's where a more global approach has got to be undertaken, more cooperation. The new globalism, at least the globalism that's consistent, I think, with our goals, is a globalism around cooperation. And there are going to be some areas that if we don't cooperate, what we're going to find is that we can't, there's just no way we're going to be able to achieve. Now, this is me, so I'd be interested. I'm looking for any kind of feedback or flat that anybody would like to offer and challenge that. But it's something we're going to have to address, and we're going to have to address it fairly quickly, because if we, and not only address, but I think we're going to have to be, there's got to be more transparency and let folks know that these are the challenges facing us. One about extraction and processing, and the other about the actual supply. And it's better that we make that and those observations and challenges than folks who are looking for ways to diminish or to criticize the renewable energy approach to climate change. I think we've got to show that we're not naive, and we're also not trying to hide, which is going to be a pretty sticky problem. So let me segue COVID response. I think in terms of Massachusetts, I think fortunately for us, we do have the Massachusetts Local Food Action Plan that at least I had a little bit of input into when I was commissioner the second time, that at least that has some real important and key strategies. Winton has pointed out many of them, and actually his more recent piece that he's written, I think really couches a lot of this in a very strong systems context. One of the things that he points out, and that obviously we're aware of, and I think it was mentioned earlier, is that we're part of a larger food system. And no matter what we do right now, we're going to have to depend upon that larger food system, in addition to what we can do locally to meet food needs and to create a more resilient food system. But that does mean that we still have to work with feds, state governments, and influence policy that goes beyond sort of our particular areas of interest and areas that we think we have direct input into. But just really quickly, the coronavirus summer, at least this year, did have some really interesting impacts, both positive and perhaps somewhat negative, on local agriculture. Clearly there was a surge in demand for local food for obvious reasons. And if there's, with any luck, that's the sort of thing that can sort of be built upon and expanded upon as people become more familiar with what is available locally, and even as it comes out of it, sort of the this contingency plan or situation. I think that it was very interesting to see that I think farmers markets were among some of the first entities to come up with protocols to deal with distancing and masking in public places, and clearly still outside farmers markets, but the whole self-organizing to a large extent without there being sort of any sort of master plan. The markets were so important both to the vendors and to the customers that they sought out solutions. And as we start to move forward, there's going to have to be a lot more of that. And we also are probably going to encounter some additional problems and challenges. Some of them have to do with some of the very positive things we're doing for farmers markets, like increasing in support for the HIP program and SNAP dollars. But it's over the past year and a half, I've been involved a little bit with the Mass Food System Collaborative around issues of how that's changed the demographics of farmers markets. Again, a lot of more, in some cases, economically challenged residents, non-English speaking residents that have created tension with some of the other customers, long-standing customers who are frustrated, perhaps because of the lengthier transactions that are going on, but there also have been some unfortunate murmurings around that have implications around lack of tolerance, racism, and have come out. And so fortunately, we have the Mass Food System Collaborative, and Winton and his crew put together some workshops and some roundtables where we just had some frank discussions about that and tried to figure out what we could do to start to relieve some of those tensions. It's not quite what I would call gentrification of farmers markets, but there were some discussions around creating separate farmers markets, some for the long-term customers and others for non-English speaking residents, low-income residents, and that was quelled. But there are issues. I have a fond spot, as you can probably tell, in my heart for farmers markets because I think they do a great deal. But I also sort of think that as we start to plan forward, there is going to have to be more coordination of schedules, among other things, because I know that farmers are frustrated now with perhaps too many farmers markets, not really scheduled properly, ill-planned, and customer, which is impacting the number of customers. There are issues that can be addressed, and I kind of, and again, hopefully not speaking out of turn, I think it's kind of important. Those are sort of the kinds of systems that we should be thinking about sort of moving forward, how the community supported agriculture also fits into that scheme of things as well. Just touching on a few other things, gleaning, again, sort of the gleaning is something we've all done for a long time, but there clearly were more of the self-initiated and self-organized issues. Thinking now about the food system, and again, if we're really sort of talking about preserving and becoming and creating a more resilient system, the question is, who's part of that system? How does that, and how do we work with others? And I just included a couple of examples here, Commonwealth Kitchen, and I think it sort of ties into the gleaning, among other things, the value added parts, the canning, and it actually can lead to entrepreneurial activities with these resources of shared resources for canning, preserving, and marketing. The Boston Public Market, I'm not sure how everybody here feels about it, probably some mixed reviews, but I think clearly an important step to have a year-round market sourcing, primarily, if not entirely, from New England. I think it's now New England, not just Massachusetts, but it's an important statement that was obviously one of the, and it was sort of interesting as you looked at the loyalty and the support for farmers markets that started with just summer markets, then expanded to fall markets, and I think now even sort of year-round indoor farmers markets. So the demand is there. How do we address that? How do we respond to it? I think you have a good idea like the Boston Public Market. Is it really a good idea? Well, now you've got a Worcester Public Market. So I think good ideas tend to replicate, tend to reproduce when they make sense and as part of a growing network and is part of a system that supports farmers and consumers, and also the value added sort of component of our food system. And it starts to come together. I'm not sure that it's as coordinated as I would like or think that it might be, but I do think that's really got to be one of the goals of whomever. I keep looking at Winton when we start talking about this sort of thing. The future of restaurants and the programs and at schools that purchase locally grown, that had committed to locally grown, it's now in jeopardy. And I'm not quite sure. None of us quite know how soon we'll be able to go back and dine indoors at restaurants. And I totally support the lockdown for health reasons. But it's not even clear that we're going to have the same number of restaurants. And how does that impact? What's that impact going to be on our local agricultural economy? I think there are things that we can start to sit down and anticipate and start thinking about. But we do need to do that in terms of trying to figure out how we can, in fact, and perhaps support some efforts. And just planning, this is just planning sessions around local agriculture technologies. I love Farm Hack in terms of, again, tailoring farm equipment to our local farmers and farm economy, which is important. A bit more controversial, perhaps. Other types of technologies are going to include things like vertical farms and aquaponics. I'm going to return to this in a little bit because these are clearly urban projects, and I know that for some folks they are controversial. I think I'm going to go out on a limb and also but say that they are probably right now a hedge a little bit against climate change. We don't know what the impacts. Well, we do have some ideas about the scenarios and that will unfold in Massachusetts and New England, and it's probably safe to say that climate controlled environments probably are going to have to play an increased role. Some things that people don't want to hear, perhaps, or maybe doesn't matter, but I do think that these efforts are can be important. The problem in terms of their impact and their relationship to the urban agricultural movement is that these are highly capital intensive, resource intensive, and almost out of the reach of local communities that are looking for economic development coming from sustainable agriculture. But it may not be, there's some things and real reasons why that has to be the case right now. Other issues around scope and scale. Are we talking state? Are we talking region? Obviously, Food Solution New England is doing some important work in terms of helping us think of the New England as the viable area to be thinking about food system planning for lots of reasons. A lot of people, a lot of cows and land in the north, obviously the food shed, and people here in Massachusetts and in southern New England. So I think their ongoing process of trying to figure out how much of our food needs could be met with varying diets and scenarios is important. Another way to look at this is how, again, local currency can facilitate and encourage the purchase of these local or regional products. The basic idea behind them, if you got local currency in your pocket and you're looking to make purchases, you're probably going to say, because I can't use this for most things outside my area, my first thought that's going to come to my mind is, can I spend my local currency on this? Knowing that if you do, you are in fact supporting the local economy and local merchants. And in the Berkshires, about 400 companies that are participating in this project. And that's what makes it work is an acceptance on the part of businesses to accept the local currency. They accept the local currency if there are enough businesses that they need to purchase from that are participating. So it really is sort of a matter of recruiting and beating the bushes and creating this understanding of why it's important and the contribution it makes. Totally legal, but it really is there's no question, it's a lot of work. One other just quick thing in terms of area, Massachusetts, states, could be the region, New England, or might it be the bio region? And there's some really interesting work going on looking at how to do using new tools, using some technologies to sort of assess the suitability of different parts of the state for different types of crops. This one happens to be agroforestry. It actually has to do with chestnuts, and basically trying to figure out, could we help create sort of an understanding of where these things make the most sense. More cooperation in terms of marketing. I know there's similar groups in Massachusetts. It just happened to be one that I had, where there's cooperation among farms that are marketing their produce and products together to give consumers a little bit more variety, a little bit more one-stop shopping. That's a little different from community support CSAs, although CSAs are probably doing some of that integration as well. But I'm just trying to sort of point out that I think that there's a lot of, from my perspective, a lot of interesting sort of developments and movements and initiatives that are creating some buffer for us. I'm just throwing this out here, not throwing it out, but looking at the regenerative agriculture, at least key concepts. And I know that soil building has always been a big one for not just NOFA, but for us in agriculture in general. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. Before I kind of wrap up, I do want to talk though about sort of the issue of diversity in our farming community. And it's a tough one for us, right? Because we all know, and this is from the USDA, that this is the situation of all private U.S. agricultural land. Whites account for 96% of the owners, 97% of the value, and 98% of the acres of all agricultural land in Massachusetts. And it's not, that's why urban farming, if you're a person of color and you live in the city, or you want to grow, to say, you don't have very many options. So that's why we've come from backyard gardening to community gardening, now to urban farming. And people are, have criticized urban farmers. My goodness, folks, you've only got like a quarter of an acre. You got a lot. And farmers who got land and experience over years, they're struggling to make an economically viable business. Why do you think you could possibly do this? What's your motivation? Why are you doing this? They're doing it because they want to grow. They love to grow. They think they can make a go of it commercially. They don't have very any other options. The past discriminatory rural land practices. This was there's about a million Black families have been ripped off on their farms over the years as part of sort of hand in hand with what goes on in the city. There's lack of farmers in the rural parts of our country, rural parts of the state, but we also find that the GI Bill and other types of programs that were established that would create opportunities to build wealth with home ownership and land ownership and home ownership were denied to African Americans. Even veterans who had gone and fought, including my father, they come back. The promise of the GI Bill does not extend to them. So cut off from land ownership, which also means if you don't have land ownership, you don't have inheritance, what are you left with? You're left with this. The median net worth of non-immigrant African American households in Boston area is $8. $8. That's the median, as opposed to 247,500 net worth for white households in Boston. This was a study done by the Boston Globe, and when they printed it, they had to make sure that they put in this sort of like disclaimer. This is not a typo, and this is the actual median net worth. What does that mean? Any emergency, any unexpected sort of event that comes up, you're wiped out. For those that have land, in many cases, because they were redlined and put into communities where disinvestment followed very closely after they had established their neighborhoods, they find that their investment, and it's not embarrassing to say this but I will tell you that my grandmother and mother, who came from Tennessee as part of the Great Migration to Cleveland, Ohio, grandmother was a maid at the Statler Hilton. Somehow she worked every day. Along grandfather, they got the house. This was going to be the beginning of the building of wealth for myself and my brother. The current value of the house, it's still standing, but it's worth $17,900. And it's because the surrounding community has sort of collapsed under. I'm going to kind of get through this. mentioned Dudley Street, using tools like community land trusts. They acquired land in a very extraordinary way. They were able to convince the city of Boston to get them the power of eminent domain because their land, their community had been burned to the ground by unscrupulous slumlords and landowners who were waiting for urban renewal to come in, and they were going to they were speculators. The community stopped that development, and as a result, the landlords, and to minimize their losses, burned their homes to the ground. And the place was pretty much left vacant. They got the power of eminent domain, and they have rebuilt. Just one, and part of their first effort was to build an urban agriculture system, which was a greenhouse. This was an old abandoned commercial garage. And they basically tore down, built a 10,000 square foot greenhouse. Even in the midst of all that was going on and the trials and tribulations, farming was still important. They were going to find a way to farm. And that's the sort of thing in terms of partnerships that are developed as you move forward. When we talk about how can we build a more diverse network, I do think, and I know it's already happening, but more relationships and more linking between sort of our rural farmers and our urban farmers. And I think through the Urban Farming Institute, that's certainly among the places where it's happening. I'm going to really quickly go through the once again, the controversial perhaps issue of soilless food production. It was key for us at New Alchemy because we were trying to figure out how we could not only use water to preserve, to conserve, trap heat energy and heat our greenhouses during the night and cold days. But we didn't want that water just to be sort of taking up space as dead space. And so the idea was you raise fish as a source of protein, in this case tilapia, and hydroponically raise. The hydroponics was really initially more of a water filtration system than a food production sort of strategy. But as it sort of developed, we realized that we could in fact use the fish waste. Actually was no longer fish waste, became nutrient rich water as it flowed through the hydroponic cucumbers, lettuce, and tomatoes. And they did the job more or less of being able to purify the water. And so the fish could continue to thrive. So there was this beautiful, I would sort of say elegant closed system that was a early form, I'll dare say, of biomimicry. But that was, again, sort of trying to figure out how we could develop the tools that would allow more people of color to farm. Recently, Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren have drafted a Justice for Black Farmers Act, and it is it's intended to provide farmers, Black farmers, with land. The proposal is that the government would buy at fair market value agricultural land that farmers are willing to sell, and that they would make it available for free to qualified African Americans. And it is, I think, just African Americans, or at this stage, and it is sort of a form of reparation. And that is sort of I don't know what the future that's going to be, but it is a very serious proposal. We at the Schumacher Society had also initiated a program called the Black Commons, and we were relying and are relying on gifted land that people would allow to be part of a nationwide community land trust that would be made to farmers to try to do it. So let me wrap up real quick and talk about, again, some sort of process for looking at how I don't think we can have the kind of response and the kind of system that can deal with the uncertainty if we don't think about changing or reshaping to a certain extent the food system as well as the economic system. So this is just sort of, again, sort of a flow pattern of how that might happen, taking a look at how we integrate sort of the core principles of resilient agriculture and circular economy to kind of try to do this. I'll end up by saying I do think some of the strategies that we're looking at start to address the energy, food, water nexus that has become sort of, we're finding ourselves in conflict to a certain extent because of the adverse impacts they tend to have on one another. This is sort of interesting. You've probably seen this spreading rock dust on the ground could pull carbon from the air and sequester and carbon. And I think it's really important. My colleague, John Todd, who just finished writing a book called Healing Earth, was very interested in that, he's also discovered that that same approach can actually help purify waters because it supports beneficial aquatic plants and animals. So he actually has a huge project to sort of take this idea and to show that there is this nexus, or at least this connection between strategy for reclaiming lands, and it's a similar project for reclaiming waters, which is a fairly inexpensive but very effective way of doing it. This is the only self-serving picture. I leave it to the end because I just want you to know we were talking about this back in 1994. We held a conference on remineralization and sustainable agriculture in 1994, U.S. Department of Agriculture. And actually in 1986, went to a conference in Chicago on climate change and talked about the same concept. Most ideas, concepts, new technologies have gestation periods. And that can range, and it's sort of interesting. Different industries have different, almost characteristic gestation periods for adopting new innovation. The fastest, aerospace, aviation. They will take a new idea and incorporate it within 2 to 5 years, maybe 2 to 3 years. The slowest is construction and housing. Incorporating new ideas into the housing industry, on average, 50 years. 50 years for any type of new idea. I mean, we did this at New Alchemy with Tyvek and super insulated buildings. We were almost run out of the Cape Cod Home Builders Association. So whatever our vision is, however we want to articulate it and illustrate it, so that people kind of understand the interrelationships that are important and necessary to build resilient and equitable food systems, we should incorporate. People learn and see in different ways. I began with Bucky, I'll end with Bucky. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So with that, I will say thank you for tolerating that. And I'm not sure if there's time or people have any questions. Thank you. Any questions or comments or not?
Thank you very much, Greg. Really appreciate that. Thank you. There are a couple of questions. If you have the time, we could take a couple of questions. Yep. I would do want to respect everyone's time.
Sure.
As we are at 8:40 now, but if everyone is amenable, we could do a couple of questions. There's one in the chat asking you to elaborate on how do we fix land ownership for Black farmers? Wondering if you have any ideas or prescriptions for that. If you go back in history, I don't know how you do this. You go back in history, there's no question. I think it was a book of Baccaroon, which was sort of the memoir or depiction of the last slave coming over to the United States, and his disappointment with Lincoln. He became a freed slave, but what he expected, along with other released slaves, was 40 acres and a mule, and the 40 acres never happened. And then for those farmers that did struggle to get it, it's a good question, but here's what I would say. What we have to do is deal with the de jure embedded regulations and laws that actually justify the kind of land taking, both in the urban areas, or discriminatory practices that either prevent land that can be acquired the way that everybody else does, based on, I'd like to, I've got the money. I'd like that piece of land because it's fertile, whatever, and I can see that's going to be a great investment. But if you're steered away legally from being able to purchase there, it's tough. So the short answer, I think the other answer is you have to deal with what will be unpopular, perhaps to some types of strategies, like the Booker and Elizabeth Warren piece of legislation, or the one that the Schumacher Center is trying to pull together, that is at least looking for gifted land that could then become part of a commons that could be made available to Black farmers. It's hard to see what some of I'd be happy to and would love to hear some other ideas, but when you think that you've already got 98% of the agricultural land in the hands of someone, and it's not people of color, it's hard to know how you're going to make that transition other than being in a position, in this case, the government, purchasing land from farmers and then making it available, from white farmers and making it available to Black farmers.
Thank you. Ellen Find raised her hand. I think it's fine if we come off of mute, and if you have a question, if you can be succinct and let Greg answer it
Succinctly.
So Greg, I just have to say this really quick statement. I don't know if you noticed, but in the chat, I was saying, I would rather have you as our new Secretary of Agriculture than Mr. Vilsack. We have all these.
I'll pay you later.
We have all these beautiful ideas and philosophies, and yet whenever we're trying to pass bills to diminish the amount of pesticides used in Massachusetts, we always, run up against the old ag thinking like, oh, this is so necessary. Oh, we have to do this. And, for me, it comes down to how we're educating folks in our agricultural, through our ag schools, and then also UMass. And so, can we be bold in Massachusetts and just take the big step and go, hey, organic is the baseline for everything? How do we create this whole new system and make Massachusetts this incredible example? And how do we really educate our legislators as well as our, ag schools and UMass and whatnot?
Yep. Well, can I say we had, and we were, and it probably still are, I'm going to say making headway. You have to understand, when I was first appointed commissioner in 1990, I was African-American, working at a place called the New Alchemy Institute, never been on a farm. And Mike Dukakis nominated me to take the place of my dear friend, departed friend, Gus Schumacher, who had to return to the World Bank. And Gus was the person who recommended that I take his place. And so I said, I'll only do that if I can call around the farmers. I mean, this is, and see if there's any real resistance. So I called farmers. I called former Commissioner Fred Winthrop. And then the last person I called was Gordon Price, who was the director of the Massachusetts Farm Bureau. And I was dreading the call because to let him know that I was been nominated. I wanted to check in with him. What did he think? And Gordon and I had a pretty long talk. And then at the end, he says, he said a couple of things. First thing he said was, you know what? We need someone who can help us start to bridge the gap between the environmental community and the farmers. We got to do it. There's absolutely no question we have to do it. But then he said to me right before, at the very end, he goes, can I ask you one question, Greg? I said, yeah. He goes, is this, back then, this was 1990, is this sustainable agriculture necessarily organic? And I said, well, Gordon, let me ask you this. If we could show you, and like using the University of Massachusetts and others, how you could start to progressively use less and less and less of the chemical inputs, whoever you are, farmer that's using them, and not jeopardize your yields, would you be interested? And he said, any farmer would be interested in knowing. And he said, well, it depends on what the labor trade-off. But we were having that discussion. And he knew that, so back then, basically, that's when we were back in the days of sort of integrated pest management and trying to figure out if we could bridge that gap. To answer your question, I would say absolutely. Now, there's got to be the leap, and there's got to be the courage on the part of folks. And you've got to be able to be able to justify it and be able to withstand the sort of the pushback you would get from folks who are going to claim, I need evidence, I need proof that this is in fact necessary, or what you're claiming are the harmful impacts. I think you already have those. But to answer your question, if we're going to move forward and make the kind of systemic change, it's got to be your first place. It's got to be your first stance, right? I mean, even if that's not eventually where you're in, but you've got to begin that discussion there. I know for a fact that there are there were farmers when I was there, and we were having some issues that would find that resistance, but that's where you've got to get the public support and the public behind you, among other things, educate them and educate your legislators and educate some of the conventional farmers as well. But I think you're right. I think we keep sort of saying, we'll wait, time's running out. We got to act. I used to have short answers, but I don't anymore.
So another request for your suggestions. What are your experiences and suggestions for encouraging schools to source food locally? How can we overcome budget constraints and reliance on USDA surplus food?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has to do, and again, Winton, I don't know where things are at. Winton could probably answer that a little better in terms of sort of the issues around competitive bidding. That may have not no longer be sort of an issue, but we did run into those sort of issues with the budgetary um, um, issues around, can you accept produce from someone whose price is higher, even if it is local. I do remember working with the folks, wasn't the public schools, but the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where they had a budgetary process where they basically had an overall budget. As long as he stayed within his overall budget, he was able to source the food from whomever. And this was sort of an important thing, because what he demonstrated was, I'm willing to do everything I can to make the necessary budget cuts in other parts of my budget that will allow me to perhaps pay slightly more, but to source from local. And as you probably know, for UMass was doing, at least as I was leaving, was doing a tremendous job of not only sourcing from farmers, but coming up with these incredible menus that were there. I actually asked them, this is a honest story. I asked them, I remember being in Nantucket one year when I was first time commissioner, and I got there for cranberry harvest, and I got a cranberry pizza. Anybody had a cranberry pizza? And it was actually pretty good. And I mentioned this to Ken Toomey and the folks there at UMass. And the next time I came, there was cranberry pizza, because he said, who can we help? What one of your industries need to help? I said, cranberries. And he did it, and it became very popular. So I think, once again, should it be short answers? The answer is, I don't know exactly where things stand in terms of procurement sort of, requirements, but that to me would be, I think there's interest there, but you've got to overcome sort of whatever those types of issues are, so that you don't put obviously the schools in a situation where they're violating some type of regulation that they just can't do. But once again, education, it really does come down to that, right? And I think if there is this ability to help people see that they're all part of the solution when it comes to food system, if we kind of are able to work together and find out how they can play a constructive role in it, I think that's sort of the way we have to do it. I know that last iteration of the plan that I saw from Winton, that actually really does give a great systems sort of description and perspective of what we're trying to do in terms of the food system, and even acknowledging what some of the shortcomings are. I think it's a very powerful tool that should be used by folks in helping to convince and persuade decision makers and folks who have to make those tough decisions.
I have one more. I think we have time for one more here, so we can wrap things up. There's a question here. What do you think of returning the basic food policy in the US to a parity system with supply management?
What do I think about the parity? I don't know that I have an answer for that. I'd have to think about what, well, I think it's a fair way to do it. I think it would make a lot of sense. But again, once again, I'm not sure what the barriers, what the obstacles are. So I'm going to when I don't have an answer, I know best not to, as I think it was Jackie Leonard who once said, sometimes it's better to keep your mouth shut and appear ignorant than to open it and remove all doubt.
That's fair. Well, let me jump to another one.
Sure.
Let's see.
I'd love to see what their answer or what they're thinking though at some point. So whoever that was, send them make sure they get my email address, and we'll talk about that.
Yes, I think, yeah, that was from Liz Henderson. There's a deep wellspring of information in Liz Henderson. So maybe there's a good conversation in the future to have.
Yeah.
And thanks for the question, Liz. Here's one. It seems cooperatives of all types fit well into the circular economy. Do you have thoughts on how ownership and control that is part of cooperatives is connected?
Yeah, sort of interesting. You know, I will say that the whole notion that part and parcel of this whole concept of the circular economy obviously is it's cooperatives, it is worker ownership, it's the commons, you know, sort of, and especially in terms of procurement. One of the interesting things when we did a delegation to Cuba to take a look at their sustainable food systems in my last year as Commissioner of Agriculture. Actually, it was organized by the Schumacher Center. And the interesting thing is that many people who, especially some of the younger farmers who went there, were sort of surprised. Agroecology in particular were very interested in what was going on there. And they were sort of surprised because they said, well, they don't seem to be doing anything that differently than, you know, what we're doing here in terms of permaculture, organic, composting. It's like to me, and I think that, and this was true of the Black farmers who went, they were less concerned about the techniques than they were about the organization. They wanted to know about the cooperatives, and because Cuba had relaxed and allowed the farming sector to be the first to explore, actually begin to start doing their own privatizing. So they allowed them to form cooperatives. They allowed some worker ownership. It became too successful. They thought it was a little too capitalistic leaning because they were actually doing a very good job. But that seemed to be when you think about what distinguishes it, what makes this work. And that's why for me, it is in fact the techniques that we use, of farming techniques, the organic and all, but it's got to be coupled with an economic framework. And that's really where and by the way, the cooperative in Cuba was worker owned, and I forget all the requirements and how much, you know, the percentage of ownership over what period of time, but everybody seemed to be happy with it. And we contrasted that to what people think about in terms of most agricultural co-ops are not really cooperative. I mean, they're very hierarchical. The big guys, right, are not cooperatives, but that cooperative model, I think, is part and parcel of what we think about in terms of new economics and a part of circular economy, and with proven track record, right, in terms of how it works as well. So key part.
Great. Thank you very much for addressing the questions and for your presentation. Really appreciate having you.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate being reintroduced to this to this important and influential group. It's been a while, and this is sort of a nice homecoming. So I appreciate your graciousness and your thoughtfulness in inviting me to, and particularly at this time. And as you can probably tell, I did pivot a bit because I did think it was important to stress some things here, maybe being one of the speakers who was able to sort of talk about some of those relationships I think are so crucial that we got to be aware and sensitive of as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also, from my own side, do appreciate how your presentation regularly acknowledged like your own learning curve and how you had checks and balances on your own evolution. And I really appreciated that. And I think that's all of us, I think, are trying to roll forward in that way, especially now. And it's a good example that I picked up on. I really appreciated that approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much.